This video is sponsored by Vox Link, a new social media app by gamers for gamers where you can find, share photos, converse with, and schedule games with other like-minded gamers in your area. More about them later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about a Tyranid tier list. Just like all of the tier lists in the channel, we're going to be breaking down every single unit in the Tyranid faction and comparing them to one another. And like many of the other tier lists I've done, this is going to be on a spectrum. Now, I have broken them down in 5 tiers. They range from bad models that you probably will never play in any of your armies, not great models that are extremely niche, mediocre models that have some play in specific detachments and builds, staple models that you'll find in most detachments or builds, and hard carries that you'll have space for in basically every list that you create. But as we always do on these tier lists, this is more of a spectrum than it is a hard list. Each of the models generally I'm comparing to the ones before or after it and rating their usefulness. Not all of them are necessarily going to be strictly better or worse than another one. Some of them will potentially change their tiers within a detachment, and in those specific cases, I will discuss that when it comes to that model. Now, as a bit of an aside as well, I played a ton of games in preparation for my coverage of the Tyranid Codex. Most of my games were either recorded or live streamed over on my Twitch channel, and they all get saved over on my VODs channel. So you can go check that out at youtube.com/tacticaltortoisetv, where all of my VODs get saved. So if you want to see my live gameplay, you can go check it out over there. And as always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k content, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, all that YouTube stuff. And with that, let's hop right in to this breakdown, starting on the bottom with the bad tier. Now, as always, there are a couple of data sheets that end up in the bottom tier here basically every time we do a tier list, and that's largely because they aren't really created to be played in normal games of Warhammer 40k. In this case, these are the Mucolid spores and the spore mine data sheets. These are units that are generated by other models over the course of the game, and while they have utility and usefulness, when they're generated for free, you wouldn't really take them by themselves, which is why they're at the bottom of the list. Moving on, we have the Sporocyst. That is one of the spore mine generators on the list right now, but unfortunately, it being a fortification is not super useful in the current game. It's difficult to score objectives with it. It doesn't have an OC value itself and kind of gets in your own way a lot of times. You can move through fortifications now with infantry models, obviously not other monsters because it is monster keyworded itself, but that doesn't really stop you from clogging up a lot of the real estate that you would want to put your more useful monsters in. Next up, we have the Tyrannocyte. This guy got some pretty hefty nerfs in 10th edition. It no longer has the same carrying capacity as it did in previous editions, not able to carry monsters of the same size. On top of that, there have been nerfs to drop pod style effects. You're not able to charge out of deep striking them, so you can use them to drop ranged attackers, which is okay. Downside being that Tyranids don't have a lot of great ranged attackers in their roster. Probably Zoanthropes are the only one that comes to mind, really. Maybe Pyrovores, but you run into problems with the size of their base and then trying to get range with them while being screened out 9 inches away. It's all just sort of awkward and weird, and generally speaking, you can just put those units in strategic reserve anyway. Having a turn 1 drop effect is good, but I don't know if it's enough to justify the extra, very expensive points value of the Tyrannocyte. That moves us on to ranged Tyranid warriors. These guys are cheap per model, so that's good, but they just have a really bad damage output. It is laughably bad. Unfortunately, compared to basically all the other infantry types in the faction, they just pale in the comparison, and it's really too bad for the shooty warrior boys. That said, later on this tier list, we'll talk about their melee variant, who is much more effective. So it's not all over for warriors, but the low ballistic skill, kind of mediocre stats of the ranged warriors doesn't really account for their relatively high points cost and puts them at the bottom of the list. This video is brought to you by Vox Link, and if you've been watching this channel for a little while, you know that I presented Vox Link to you in the past. And with the help of everyone who watched those videos and jumped on the original Vox Link Kickstarter, that was actually fully funded and is now available for use. This is a social media app for gamers by gamers, and right now it gives you the option to browse a wide variety of gaming content. You can see things like painting tutorials, battle reports about a wide variety of miniatures games that you select reflect when you register for the app. I especially appreciate that it has a news feed for specific games that you can sign up for, so you can see new news, community posts, and upcoming events for these games that you are specifically interested in. You can even then show off your own models to the community and get stuck in with some interesting discussions surrounding your favorite miniature games, all within Vox Link. Not only that, but you can also browse creators in specific categories. So if you want to see videos specifically about the games that you're interested in, you can see which creators are currently active within those games. Even, it's yours truly. I'm right here. I only have 4 likes though, so let's get on in there and bump those rookie numbers up. We gotta beat Zorp. So please download the app from the iOS or App Store. Go to that creators section, hit the little heart button next to Tactical Tortoise, and then also avail yourself of all of the other exciting features. What Vox Link is trying to create is not only a social media app, but also have the functionality to register for events and find players in your area. This is an absolutely invaluable resource for both new and returning players to the hobby, and the best way to get the word out is to join on. So go hop onto it in the iOS and Android store, and I'll see you on the Vox Link. Another ranged infantry unit that finds itself at the bottom down here are the Hive Guard. These guys have some really interesting ranged weapons that they can include, including an indirect fire weapon as well as an anti-vehicle weapon, both things the Tyranids would love to have in spades. Unfortunately for the Hive Guard, they are individually expensive, and their renditions of these weapons are just horrible. The shock cannon anti-vehicle weapon would be nice, except it is a low AP, not ignoring cover shot, so most of the time your opponents with a good saving characteristics are just going to save out of it, even if you overcommit lots of Hive Guard into the fight with them. And they don't do anything against monsters, obviously. They are anti-vehicle only, so if your opponent takes other heavy units that aren't necessarily vehicle keyworded, the Hive Guard aren't really doing anything for you. That moves us on to the Heirophant Bio Titan. This guy's pretty spicy. He's extremely hard to kill with a lot of wounds and a high save characteristic, but the downside for him is the physical mass. He did get a little bit of a side grade in the latest data slate with the changes to the towering keyword, so he's no longer automatically seen through ruins, basically, as long as Tyrannocyte can be drawn. But the opposite is also not true. He no longer sees through opposing ruins, which I think on the whole is a little bit worse for the Hierophant. On top of that, it's physically enormous, difficult to move around the table, in some cases hard to deploy, and those are all really, really big downsides for this big spider. That moves us on to the aircraft, the Harpy and the Hive Crone, both at the bottom tier on the list. These things are just expensive with an abysmal damage output. And while there are situations in which they can be useful, you can take them in things like detachments like Vanguard Onslaught to deep strike them on the first turn. That's pretty interesting and cool, but you're deep striking a unit with very bad ranged attacks that is not that hard to kill. It's really not actually that exciting when it comes right down to it. The aircraft keyword itself is fairly valuable. It's one of the only ways that you can ignore opposing ruin terrain when shooting. The towering units don't do that anymore, only aircraft do, but the weapons that you're shooting with them are laughably bad. You're also not really getting too much use out of spawning spore mines with the Harpy, because you're already going to be taking a biovore most likely to spawn spore mines itself, so you're trying to use it for its bombing run ability. It forces you to jump through some hoops in order to do so, because if you are taking it in aircraft mode and not hovering with it, you will have to put it into strategic reserve and then find a way to get it out of there before it can bomb, which is just a lot of work. Now, moving on to the end of the bad tier, we have this poor guy, the Toxicrene. This guy is just kind of a failure of a design, I think. It's a physically enormous model, which doesn't mean it gets cover easily, but it also means that every enemy is going to have line of sight to it all the time. It kind of like has the old school towering just because of the fact that it's like too large to actually hide behind buildings. On top of that, it's an anti-infantry monster, not something that Tyranids necessarily need in great spades. They have a lot of anti-infantry options elsewhere in the faction. They have some extremely strong blast weapons, and for a while, at least pre-data slate, I think, before they saw nerfs to things like Zoanthropes, were probably the most infantry-hating faction maybe in the whole game. They did not need this guy to help out with them with some mediocre melee attacks. It does have a mortal wound pulse and some anti-fallback mechanics, which are pretty interesting and cool, but I don't really think that they take it out of the level of being not very useful in any case. You if you have this kit, you just build it into a Maleceptor. Maleceptors are fucking amazing, and the Toxicrene is not. That moves us on to the not great tier. Well, the bad tier has really tough time finding place in any list. The not great tier can be situationally in some compositions. That starts us off with the Parasite of Mortrex. This thing lost the Synapse keyword in the recent update in the new codex, which is kind of baffling, meaning that there are no lone operative Synapse characters available for Tyranids. It is the only lone operative non-Deathleaper character, so it can be assigned enhancements, which is nice, but there aren't that many enhancements that you actually want to assign it. It has some interesting Battle Shock Matters abilities, but on a relatively expensive, kind of fragile platform, overall not that great. You'd be better off taking Lictors or other lone operatives elsewhere in the faction. It also gives up Assassination, which is just a big downside. Moving on, we have the Psychophage. This is an interesting support piece and relatively tanky for its point cost with a 5+, Feel No Pain, and grants a 6+ Feel No Pain to units around it. And there are some compositions that really like that. Assimilation Swarm, obviously love it because it does have the Harvester keyword, so taking one in there to buff your Haruspexes when they're not making use of a Blade of Carapace and just regenerate wounds on people is pretty good. In addition, Endless Swarm compositions like them too. Being able to project a 6+ Feel No Pain aura for a bunch of units that can string back to it is incredibly useful. And on top of that, and you can stack that with a lot of other benefits. You can give them a 6+ Invulnerable save with Zoanthropes and stealth and potential cover from Venomthropes. All of those are pretty useful when you stack them together to large units of 20 models that are chaining back to the triumvirate of buffs. That's pretty interesting include for this guy. The big downside of the Psychophage is that it doesn't do anything else whatsoever. It does practically no damage output. It has a horrible flamer that's incredibly underpowered, and honestly, as a just solely support unit, it's wildly overcosted for what you get. It's competing directly with some of your frontline monsters, and it itself does not actually contribute to the fight almost whatsoever. So would largely leave this guy at home outside of those very specific builds. The Screamer Killer's the next one. This is kind of the same song. It is a little bit unfortunate how the Leviathan box set monsters really got hamstrung by their points cost. The Screamer Killer does have a really interesting use case, which is forcing battle shock checks on enemies within your shooting phase at a -1 leadership penalty. That's huge, especially when you can combine it with other -1 leadership penalties from things like Deathleaper. And now we have Neurolictors and other synergies with Battle Shock. Having a Screamer Killer be forcing those tests on your opponent is super useful. The downside is that you're getting a mediocre body for that ability that costs as much as some of the best monsters in the Codex. I think if this thing got a significant points decrease, it would actually be incredibly playable and potentially really, really strong. The problem is that at 170 points, you just can't do that. It's again almost solely a support unit, and you're paying frontline fighter points for it, which is not great. That moves us on to the Tyrannofex, how the mighty have fallen with this one. Unfortunately, the Tyrannofex was great moving on into the data slate. When the Codex released, it got debuffed, trading its -1 damage effect for a Blade of Armor effect, which is significantly worse. The downside of that a Blade of Armor is that you have to declare its use before you roll your saving throw. So you might just burn it to 0 damage an attack that you might have just saved anyway. Really inefficient and kind of inconsistent. And on top of that, they got a massive points hike. It's probably the only caddy for a big, huge, long-range gun that's not really carried by a 300+ point Titan, and that's pretty interesting, and the Acid Spray profile is still okay, I guess, but I would almost 100% leave these guys at home most of the time. Tyrant Guard are the next one. Don't super love these guys. They are bodyguards for the Nero Tyrant and the Hive Tyrant, and pay kind of a lot of points for a really mediocre defensive stat line and a slow unit that doesn't actually really help your survivability that much in a lot of cases because they are lower toughness than the Tyrants that they are protecting. Their damage output is abysmally bad, and there are very few ways to buff their survivability outside some stratagems, largely because they don't get a lot of the aura effects. They don't get things like the Venomthrope aura because if you're attached to a character into them, they're a monster unit now, and so the Venomthrope doesn't apply. They'll still get cover, obviously, but you really want them to have that stealth, and unfortunately, that's not really how it works. Pretty unfortunate for the Tyrant Guard, but I do think there is a build in Assimilation Swarm that actually makes good use of them being able to regenerate multiple Tyrant Guard a turn and buff their offensive output. I have a video about that combo coming out later this week, so just stay tuned, and I'll talk more about them and the way you make Tyrant Guard good. That moves us on to the Trygon. I like this guy conceptually, but I think the points value is, again, a little bit too high for this dude. He's unfortunately a little limp-wristed. He hits kind of like a wet noodle once he gets to melee, but his ability to deep strike 3 inches away from enemies rather than the normal 9, as long as he doesn't charge, is really good. You have to combo it with Rapid Ingress to allow him to charge the next turn, but it basically guarantees that he's going to be in melee the turn immediately after he ingresses on your opponent's turn. With a lot of flexibility on where he can deep strike into places where your opponent can't see, and then walk around a corner, blow up something, kill a bunch of infantry, steal an objective, and that's all super useful. Whether it's 180 points useful is the real question, and I think generally speaking, it's not, especially if you get into a matchup where your opponent has heavier targets. This guy's going to pop in, charge something, bounce off of it, and then die, and then you'll feel very sad. If he was 1 or 2 pips higher strength, I would feel much better about him, or if he was 20 or 30 points less expensive, I think I would like him a lot more, and he would probably jump a tier or 2 at least in this tier list, but at the points level he currently is, he's not really worth that much. Moving on to the Winged Hive Tyrant. This guy is another little bit of a sad story in terms of points value. Definitely both the Hive Tyrant varieties are paying a lot of extra points for their free stratagem ability, despite the fact that this free stratagem ability only actually works in a couple of detachments, just because of the access to battle tactic stratagems that target your own units. And there aren't that many. The Winged Hive Tyrant is good in Vanguard Onslaught, but because of its ability to advance and charge with the Vanguard Invader keyword and really get up the table, do some melee damage, and be a very flexible melee combatant, which is an incredible include for that Vanguard Onslaught list that sometimes has a bit of a trouble with armor cracking. The downside is the points value. I think if you cut a couple points off these guys, they would be incredibly strong, or you buffed their free stratagem ability to use on multiple stratagems. I think they would increase significantly in power level, and we could probably see them a tier or 2 above. Unfortunately, they're kind of a 0 to 1 in Vanguard Onslaught. They are good for the one that you include, but any more than that, they get a little bit pricey. That moves us on to the Barbed and Scythed Heirodules. These guys were looking great moving into the data slate and getting lots of buffs potentially from the new detachments in the Codex. The downside is that I think, according to the Games Workshop superiors, they probably competed directly with the Norn Emissary and the Norn Assimilator, the 2 new exciting and shiny kits from the Codex, and unfortunately for us, and unfortunately for the Heirodules, they were deemed the less profitable of the 2. So they got a massive points increase moving on post-data slate season, despite the fact that they weren't really widely played before that. I think that basically you would almost just hard swap the positions of the Norn Emissary and Assimilator with these guys if they were still at their original points value. The problem is that they're about 50 to 60 points more expensive, but they do bring better profiles to the table. They have a higher toughness, more wounds. They don't have the built-in potential invulnerable saves and feel no pains that the Norns do, but they have actually good guns and melee attacks, which the Norns are lacking. So it is a trade-off. I just think that the 300 to 350 point range is probably a little bit too many for these guys, especially with how physically large they are. That moves us on to another combo unit, the Genestealers and the Broodlord. Honestly, I wasn't 100% sure where to put these guys. I liked them in the pre-data slate version before the Codex was released because they did have some pretty hefty damage output with ruined rerolls against enemies on objectives. That rule was removed from the unit, and now you just get a very expensive melee beater that it does like okay damage, I guess. Very good at, again, clearing chaff like a lot of things in the Tyranid Codex, but that, again, is not something that Tyranids are really lacking in, so they're not really filling a niche that much. I had high hopes for these guys in Vanguard Onslaught because I thought they could add some punch to Vanguard Onslaught while being able to advance and charge with a pretty solid base movement characteristic and scout. All of those together would make a unit that's very powerful, but unfortunately, their damage output's not that great, and they are extremely expensive, especially once you attach the character. That said, in Invasion Fleet and some of the other detachments that can buff their damage output a little bit, they do have the volume of pretty decent attacks to make use of some offensive buffs and can kind of cleave through heavier targets relatively well. So they're not useless, and I don't think that you're really hurting too much for taking them in your army, but I don't think that I would go out of my way to play too many Genestealers. That moves us on to the mediocre tier. These guys in some very specific detachments are relatively solid, and I think that you see play of them a lot. You could slot them into most compositions and not really feel too bad about them. The first one that we're going to talk about is the Tervigon. If you're in an Unending Swarm detachment, the Tervigon has some interesting utility. You can combine its lethal hits effect with the stratagem to make the unit that you use it on critical on 5+, to make them lethal on 5+, and actually get some solid damage output out of regular Termagants, which is not really something the Tyranids are very used to. That's pretty cool. They regenerate models into units, which is also pretty cool, and they're a relatively tanky monster. Also pretty cool. Generally pretty cool. I wouldn't take them outside of very specific lists like the aforementioned Unending Swarm or maybe some Invasion Fleet compositions where you're running a lot of Termagants, but if you are running tons of Termagants, definitely consider a Tervigon. Moving on, we have Neurogaunts. These guys, which is pretty good, I guess. They're like 44 points, you get 10 dudes. I do think that the existence of one-man unit Ripper swarms has kind of decreased the usefulness of the Neurogaunts. You used to see them in lists all the time, but the Rippers, in order to you perform actions and kind of fill up additional points, but the Rippers have really taken their spot. So that's why they're kind of in the middle here, but they really never feel bad about taking a unit of them. They screen well, they hold objectives, they can perform actions, they can just be thrown away on a whim because they're basically free, and that's all pretty good. Moving on, we have the Mawloc. This guy with the new synergies to Battleshock has actually become a little bit more useful because he can potentially be forcing Battleshock checks on your opponent early on in the game. In Vanguard Onslaught, he's gotten a little bit of a lease on life as well, being able to deep strike on the first turn with seeded broods. That's pretty sweet. And then you can potentially make use of the Neurolictor's ability as well as early shooting to kind of devastate your opponent with an Alpha Strike. Vanguard Onslaught very Alpha Strike oriented for sure. Anything that forces Battleshock checks on a whim right now is pretty effective, just because you get more opportunities to leverage the Neurolictor aura. So the Mawloc isn't too bad of an include. He's also not a huge investment like the Trygon is, and while he has less of an opportunity to deep strike because he doesn't have the 3-inch deep strike roll, he can still usually get where he needs to try to battle shock the units in the front of your opponent's army that are the ones you're going to be engaging with. Moving on, we have Von Ryan's Leapers. These are an interesting unit. I think they really only have a lot of play in Vanguard Onslaught, which makes them faster and gives them a pre-battle redeploy. So after the roll to go first, they're able to see whether or not they can Alpha Strike their opponent, and if they can't, they'll just run away, and that's excellent for the unit. The ability to advance and charge and infiltrate means that if they are set up in an advantageous spot on the table, they can really like dumpster your opponent and lock them in their deployment zone early if you are going first with a Vanguard Onslaught list. Even outside of Vanguard Onslaught, they are actually pretty effective at keeping your opponent penned into their deployment zone, and they have an interesting defensive profile because they have strikes first and they're more aggressively positioned. So if you can put them in a place where your opponent doesn't get line of sight to them but has to charge them to get rid of them, they'll actually get the first opportunity to swing and actually potentially trade up before they go down. That said, you really want them in Vanguard Onslaught to get the most value out of them. I could see them in some other detachments, but Vanguard Onslaught really uses them the best in my opinion. They're extremely strong going first. They're a very good Alpha Strike unit, but they're a little bit worse going second, which is why they're sort of in the middle here. But I do think that, yeah, they have a lot of play. Next up, we have another armor cracker, Harridan, my main man. This guy saw a huge points decrease in the new data slate, which was enormous for him. He is one of the premier armor cracking units in the Tyranid faction right now, with Strength 10, AP3, 3 damage guns that not only blast, but also give themselves +1 to wound, meaning they wound basically the entire game on 4s, maybe 3s. On top of that, he is aircraft, so he does have the potential to, if he's in aircraft mode, run around the table and see over ruins, as long as he has true line of sight, which is really easy because he's enormous. So enemies have a tough time hiding from him, and in detachments like Vanguard Onslaught, you can also deep strike him on the first turn to get line of sight to your opponents and really just like Alpha Strike them just directly off the table. Harridan has a lot of interesting synergies. There's also some detachments like Synaptic Nexus where you can use him pretty effectively because they buff his survivability and his offensive output with rerolls. Both of those places are pretty good for him, and you can maybe make some use of him in other situations as well. I think there is a lot of optionality to Harridan. I think there is a lot of flexibility to Harridan in different detachments. The downside is the points value. He's coming in at 600 points. He's taking up a third of your list, and while he does have the best option to actually apply damage to enemy targets, whereas slower units like Maleceptors or Zoanthropes can't really get lines to a lot of units early on in the game. The downside is that obviously you're having to protect 30% of your army and get value out of it over the course of the game. And that can be a little bit tough because he doesn't really have any built-in defensive. If your detachment you're in makes him harder to kill, then that is great. He's going to go down to dedicated shooting in a turn or two, which is a little bit scary. So there are going to be a lot of matchups where Harridan's not that useful. I think you really have to be careful how you use him. That moves us on to the Haruspex. These guys were touted as being like the most broken unit in the game for a while, just because of their low points value at 125 points. The downside, of course, is that they're a slow melee unit. They just want to stand up in the middle and beat your opponent to death and then put them into their mouth. And the one detachment that makes it good is Assimilation Swarm. In Assimilation Swarm, they're basically, I think, you just take 3 of them almost every time because they turn on every single one of the synergies in the detachment. Otherwise, I think you would almost always rather replace these guys with some more ranged oriented and more consistent units. But you never feel bad about taking Haruspexes. It's almost not worth it for your opponent to shoot them because they're hard enough to kill that they won't really trade up, which is a benefit in and of itself, even if the Haruspex doesn't really get that much damage through. Unfortunately, you also have to consider real estate in a Tyranid's army, and a Haruspex is a huge unit that's going to be taking up a lot of the board presence that you could be filling with Norns or with Maleceptors. So it's a finite resource that you can't really throw away with Abandon, which is why I think you don't see Haruspexes so much anymore. But again, in that Assimilation Swarm, you're going to see them all the time. And now at the end of the mediocre tier, we have the Norn Assimilator. Now, I did a video recently, earlier this week, talking about the Norn Assimilator versus the Norn Emissary and the differences between the two. Generally speaking, the Norn Assimilator being more expensive, while it is better at punching tanks, which is a good place for it to be, isn't quite as survivable, which is really what you want out of your expensive Norn units. So it definitely gets a tier down from where the Norn Emissary ends up. That said, it's not a horrible include, it's just kind of mediocre. It's expensive, it's tough to engage with. You can strategic reserve it sometimes, and that's kind of useful. Getting a Rapid Ingress into shooting a vehicle with its Tox Injector harpoons to get a charge bonus, so you can get some wild and wacky angles, is pretty good. It does need some help to actually be able to one-shot vehicles most of the time, though, so you still need to invest a little bit to get your already hefty investment to make up its points, but I don't think it's awful, just kind of whatever. Moves us on to another combination unit, the Carnifexes and Old One Eye. These guys are kind of like the dedicated armor cracking of the faction right now. Old One Eye has insane damage output once he's attached to a Carnifex. The unit becomes extremely flexible and extremely reliable. The downside is trying to get them into melee. They're relatively slow monsters, and while they do have a reactive move, that does have to move directly towards the nearest enemy, so there are situations where your opponent can abuse it to try to prevent you from using it, because if you do so, you'll just move into the teeth of more guns. That said, it is a good option for Rapid Ingress. You can put it into a position where only a couple ranged attacks have line of sight to them. If your opponent elects to take the shot, you're just making your charge easier, and the next turn you can get in with these dudes, and they will kill almost any large vehicle or monster in melee in one round of combat. On top of that, you can also kit the Carnifexes to be anti-infantry with a lot of anti-infantry guns and bioplasma, and Old One Eye gives them rerolls both in the shooting and fight phase, so he actually makes them good at shooting. He shores up the unit's weakness at fighting, and altogether they just sort of complement each other well. That said, outside of Old One Eye's unit, I don't think you're going to see Carnifexes that much at all. They're unfortunately, they don't hit very hard. They are very inaccurate without the rerolls to hit. So you're basically only on the 2 or 3 man unit, Old One Eye and 1 or 2 Carnifexes in some lists. That moves us on to Barbgaunts, and with the Genestealer Cult faction being less powerful now than it was in the past, the usefulness of low AP mass blast attacks isn't quite as predominant as it was in the pre-data slate season. So the Barbgaunts have fallen pretty far. That said, they're still very good against low save infantry, probably one of the most efficient infantry sweepers, maybe in 40k. For 60 points, you can basically just shoot any number of T3 5-up save dudes to death, basically, regardless of what they've got going for them. You'll just kill them with 5 Barbgaunts. As soon as you apply any sort of buff to them whatsoever, they're just going to trade up against enemy infantry. They don't really have any usefulness beyond that, but they are super cheap. So that's pretty good. Yeah, not too much else to say about them. They're very good against infantry. If infantry is a thing that you have to deal with, Barbgaunts are going to be amazing. They're very good, I guess, even in the Tyranid mirror match. If they're fighting unending swarms, Barbgaunts will just sweep that whole thing over and over and over again with no problem. And that moves us on to the staple categories. These are units that you actually wouldn't feel too bad about including in most of your builds. Maybe not every single one, but they definitely have multiple detachments that they are good into. And some of these units you'll take in a lot of armies. We're starting with the Tyranid Warriors, the Melee Warriors, and the Winged Tyranid Prime. These are definitely a conjoined unit. You're almost always attaching your Winged Tyranid Prime to the Melee Warriors, and he helps them in a bunch of different ways. First off, in Vanguard Onslaught, he makes them way faster, giving them advance and charge, which is enormous, but also he kind of buffs the speed of the unit just by being a higher speed model himself. You can deploy the unit in a defensive position where the Melee Warriors are in the front and the Winged Prime is in the back. Then when you move them, the Winged Prime, because it's double the speed of the rest of the unit, can leapfrog the Warrior unit and actually usually get you about 2 or 3 additional inches of movement once he extends the end of his coherency, which makes your charges that much easier. So they really go from being kind of a move 6 infantry to being almost closer to a move 8 infantry unit. And once they get into melee, they are incredibly lethal, especially if you can source any wound bonuses on them. If they are being affected by the Neurolictor aura, that's huge. If you have other wound bonuses, even just things like lethal hits from Invasion Fleet or a Broodguard Impulse from Assimilation Swarm, those are both enormous on these guys. They are kind of mid-strength, mid-AP attacks, but with a massive number of attacks, high reliability thanks to reroll 1s from their own dueling ability, and the Tyranid Prime giving them sustained 1. They have an enormous volume of attacks with wound rerolls from Twin Linked. They actually do insane damage. I would say that I think Vanguard Onslaught is probably the #1 place for these guys to live, but I could also see them in Synaptic Nexus, where they get a big benefit from a lot of the detachment abilities. On top of that, like I said, Assimilation Swarm, maybe there might be some other use cases for them. I definitely think that these guys were kind of one of these success stories of the new Codex. They went from being really kind of underplayed to being actually pretty useful when it comes to digging deeper into the faction on the different detachments. Raveners are the next one. These are just a solid utility unit. They're relatively cheap. They're very good at sweeping infantry or even beating up light vehicles with a huge number of low AP twin-linked attacks. That's pretty nice. On top of that, they can deep strike multiple times per game. Also very good. Not really too much bad to say about the Raveners. Honestly, the downside is that they're a little expensive compared to other utility units, but they also bring some combat to the table, so I think that's great. They can punch good if they need to. They can score objectives good if they need to. They're just generally a useful unit. Moving on, we have the Norn Emissary. This is just a big objective controlling tank. Now, the downside of the Norn Emissary is that it is competing directly with a lot of the other really powerful units we're going to talk about at the top of the list here. You can take it alongside units like Maleceptors, and they kind of have a similar defensive profile, so they sort of do a good job of pulling focus from one another and buying a lot of table space for you. But that's basically the only use case of the Norn Emissary. It's going to choose an objective for its singular purpose, and it's going to move directly towards that objective and stand on it for the entire game, or at least 2 to 3 turns until your opponent finally kills it. They're a little bit of a stat check. They're difficult to kill for a lot of factions with a 4+ invulnerable save, 2+ armor save, and 5+ feel no pain once their singular purpose has been fulfilled. But at the end of the day, they're no harder to kill than, something like an Imperial Knight. In fact, they're much easier to kill than most Imperial Knights. So if your opponent is good at killing Knights, they're going to be able to kill the Emissary. And the downside of this thing is it doesn't really actually punch that well itself. It doesn't actually do that much damage. I would say I think the Emissary is a pretty good include in a lot of detachments, at least as a 0 to 1 option, but I don't think that it is an automatic take. I think oftentimes you'd rather take other monsters that are at the top of the list here over the Emissary, and it kind of competes with them directly, which is a little bit too bad. If you have them instead of units like Maleceptors, it's not the end of the world, they're just a slightly less efficient. That moves us on to Zoanthropes. The mighty have fallen pretty far here. These are probably, arguably one of the best units in the Codex, at least in the index version. Unfortunately, they got hammered with one of the highest points increases in the entire data slate. They got an almost 25% points increase, almost as much as the Incarn, actually, if that... It kind of staggers belief, but basically as much as the Incarn. Games Workshop rated the power level of Zoanthropes to be around that of the Incarn, and that's silly. These guys have good all-purpose shooting. They have a solid blast attack that's good at sweeping infantry and is pretty solid against heavy infantry, and they have a decent anti-tank laser cannon. The downside is that they're very poorly reliable. You need to dump a lot of buff effects onto them to get the most use you can out of the Zoanthrope unit, and most of the time, if they're entirely unsupported, they will come off the table, roll a bunch of dice at your opponent, do nothing, and then die. So they're a little overcosted for what you get, but unfortunately, as basically the only caddy for reliable, or at least kind of easy access to strength 12 plus attacks in the entire faction, you kind of gotta put them up here. And most lists will take a couple of them just to potentially give them an answer to high toughness enemies. The downside is that reliability. They just are casino. They're basically just a slot machine of a unit that fires a low volume of shots with mediocre ballistic skills and pretty standard offensive profiles and D6 damage. So they could do anywhere from 2 to 7, which is a pretty wide variety variety. I wish these things are a little bit more consistent or cheaper, so you could have more of them. Either one of those would be great. And unfortunately, the depowerment of Zoanthropes, I think, just basically depowered the entire Tyranid faction slightly, just given the fact that this was like the dedicated anti-tank of the faction, and no longer are they as efficient as they were. That said, we do have other tools to fall back on now. The Neurolictor Aura is big for clearing high toughness units, so it's not all bad for Tyranids, but it is unfortunate for the Zoanthropes. Termagants and Hormagaunts are next. These guys are basically in the same spot. They're cheap infantry, and they're great in high model count horde armies. They're also pretty good just as an include to hold objectives and scurry around the table and keep your opponent off balance. They're significantly worse than one of the units that we'll talk about at the top, the other battle line Gant unit from the faction, Gargoyles. So I think they basically get shunted down a tier just because of how powerful Gargoyles are right now. That said, there are a lot of list compositions that are reliant on units like Hormagaunts advancing up the table, charging onto enemy objectives and preventing them from scoring. That's huge. Or just spamming Termagants with defensive buffs on them to try to keep them alive and hold down primary objectives. Both of those compositions are very valid, and the units themselves are pretty solid for their points value to begin with, so can't really say too much bad about them. They're just a pretty decent set of units. The Swarmlord is the next one. This guy's stock went up quite a bit when the change to duplicated and free stratagems went through in the data slate update, and they had to be used on battle tactic stratagems because the Hive Tyrant's ability got depowered significantly. So Swarmlord just passively generating command points for you is pretty good. On the flip side, his own CP tax effect, it was depowered a little bit, but a lot of the stratagems you'd use that on anyway were battle tactics already, so that isn't a huge change for him. Compared to the Hive Tyrant, he is still monumentally less efficient, just given the fact that he only gives you 1 CP rather than the potential 2-ish that a Hive Tyrant could give you every battle round. He's also way more expensive, probably too expensive for what he gives you, which is kind of a mediocre offensive profile and not very strong defensive stats. So that's a little unfortunate for our poor swarmy boy over here. That said, the ability he gives you is unique in the whole faction, so you can't look anywhere else to get CP reliably, and Swarmlord is your only option for that. So if you want it, you can take him. I think he's good in a lot of detachments, especially the more command point hungry ones, and you won't feel too bad about including him in your army. He's just going to be a huge point sink, which is unfortunate. Venomthropes are the next one. These guys are just a solid defensive buff. They give cover to monsters, which is good if you're deploying your monsters out in the open, especially on the first turn, or they're moving into the middle of the table to hold mid-board objectives. Being able to project cover onto them is huge. On top of that, in the infantry-based lists, these guys granting stealth in a huge aura and allowing your infantry to chain back to that to gain that stealth is also a big deal, and they're extremely inexpensive. They're good against infantry as well once you get to melee, and they are just another unit that can screen, perform actions, just take up table space for very, very inexpensive points per wound, which is solid. Love the Venomthropes. Take them in a lot of lists, especially if you're running a ton of infantry. They pair well with Zoanthropes in my experience because they're able to sit inside the big brick of Zoanthropes and give them all a hit penalty, which is very good for that unit because they tend to die like flies. So we'll take Venomthropes in most armies that at least that are focused on infantry, and some of the ones that focus on monsters as well, if those monsters want to start the game out in the open. The Neuro Tyrant is the next one. This guy's gotten a huge glow up in the new Codex. Not only is its Shadow in the Warp now more effective with units like Neurolictors in the mix, but it's also now able to project its Synapse ability out to 18 inches rather than 12, which from where the Neuro Tyrant wants to stand affects a huge swath of the board and gives you a ton of options to use it. So if you have units in the front line that are getting depowered or getting battle shocks forced on them by enemy shooting, you can then buff them up with the Neuro Tyrant. And the Neuro Tyrant's ability to project that Synapse onto a unit before the battle shock check step means that you can react to units that get damaged, which is excellent. The Neuro Tyrant is pretty good at shooting too. It has a solid 2 damage flamer, and on top of that, it's kind of a hardy body that once it uses its Shadow in the Warp ability, you don't really need to baby too much. It's relatively inexpensive, can wander around the table. It's not easy enough to kill that your opponent can do it trivially. They kind of have to commit to actually remove this guy, and if they don't, he's just going to wander around and blow up their infantry for a while. Moving on to the top bracket in the tier list, the hard carry section. These are units that you are most likely taking in almost, if not every single Tyranid list, whereas the other units in the tier list are largely flex includes, and you take them in some detachments and some builds. This top tier are in most builds, I would say. Maybe not 100%, but the vast majority for sure. We're starting with the standard foot Hive Tyrant. This guy can still project you some free stratagems. The number of stratagems you get are less numerous than you did previously, just because of the fact that he can only affect a handful of battle tactic stratagems in each detachment. But some detachments like Invasion Fleet and Synaptic Nexus have lots of battle tactic stratagems that the Hive Tyrant is going to be affecting. So in those detachments, he's basically an auto include, and in the other detachments, he's a strong consideration. Giving your ranged units, and Tyranids tend to have very short range weapons, Assault in an aura as well is also invaluable, and honestly, largely the reason you take him. He makes things like Maliceptors and Zoanthropes much faster when they're actually trying to apply their ranged attacks, and it just makes their threat range less predictable. It makes your opponent less able to just entirely blank your move and shoot with these guys. He also affects the next unit on the tier list, the Pyrovore. The Pyrovores have an incredibly short range and an extremely big base now with their new resculpt, which I had some harsh words for over on my Tactical T-Orders TV channel the other day. If I remember to do so, I'll put a card up in the video for my clip about that. That said, the Pyrovore, if it is next to a Hive Tyrant, is extremely useful for removing cover off enemies that are trying to brawl in the middle with your big beaters, things like Maliceptors that are shooting huge cannons at them. Removing cover from people is huge, and being able to do so at an extended range thanks to the Hive Tyrant is a big deal. Now, the Pyrovores themselves are very, very strong. And it's physically an enormous model, which is actually okay in some instances if you're trying to screen or take up real estate with them. They also have pretty solid damage output for their points, and they have kind of the Cyberwolf effect of being a single model unit for not too expensive. For 30 points, you get a big kind of burly profile that's hard to remove efficiently, has a pretty good gun, and can independently perform actions, score secondaries, stand on objectives, and do all the normal things that units can do. On top of that, if you have multiple of them, they can actually start to pose a threat even to larger units, and especially once you start buffing them with wound buffs, things like Broodguard Impulse from Assimilation Swarm or the Neurolictor Aura for +1 to wound. Both of those mean they actually start to plink heavy vehicles for some serious damage, on top of buffing the rest of your ranged attacks against those vehicles. Pyrovores are just incredible. I think most Tyranid lists are behooved to take one of them just to situationally remove cover from high armor save units, Terminators and Land Raiders and things like that. They're going to bully up the table to your low AP, AP2-ish weapons on things like Maliceptors. The Pyrovore can get in there and essentially just give you +1 AP against that unit, which is a huge buff. But on top of that, you can also bring them to actually deal damage, and if you have a Hive Tyrant in your list especially, I would strongly consider taking more, just to give you more options to use them. They're just super efficient for 30 points, and you're never really going to look twice about taking them. Moving on, we have the Exocrine, kind of a similar looking guy. This guy has a big long-ranged gun for super cheap, and that's about where it ends. He also gives you reroll ones to hit with your ranged attacks, which is also incredibly strong, but largely you're taking this dude for the fact that his gun's long range. It's extremely good against heavy infantry, which is useful, and it can clear light infantry as well in some instances, just because it has the blast characteristic. It's mostly used to kill Gravis armor and Terminator armored enemies, but in some instances it's good in other situations too. If you are buffing its lethality at all, if you're giving it wound benefits or giving it lethal hits from Invasion Fleet or something like that, it can start to plink damage, 3 to 6 damage off heavy vehicles when it shoots as well, which makes it a threat that your opponent can't really ignore, even if it's relatively inconsistent at doing that. That said, that inconsistency is easy to swallow because this thing is basically free. For 135 points, getting a very tanky body that has a very good gun that also has an army support ability means that Exocrines are good in almost every Tyranid list without really having to lean into the gunline style. Once you are playing a gunline and you're taking a lot of things like Maliceptors and Zoanthropes, the Exocrine's power level goes through the roof and just starts to make the entirety of your army more efficient. Moving on, we'll talk about Lictors and the Deathleaper together as well. These are ridiculously efficient lone operatives. They have infiltrate, they have strikes first, so they're tough to get to grips with in melee. It's very difficult to remove them once they get dug in like a tick, and they can also potentially alpha strike your opponent if they deploy aggressively, or simply just kill their characters out of units that are trying to skirmish around the edges of the table. Honestly, all good things. You can't really go wrong by taking Lictors or the Deathleaper. Now the Deathleaper obviously is the upgraded incarnation of the Lictor and has a lot of benefits over the standard Lictor. It's harder to kill with better saves and an invulnerable save, but really the reason you're bringing it is for its leadership affecting abilities. It forces an additional battle shock check on your opponent if they're below starting strength, not just if they're half strength, if they're within 6 inches in their own battle shock step. So you can potentially be forcing 2 battle shock checks on your opponent at -1 leadership from the Deathleaper's aura. If you use Shadow in the Warp at the same turn, the Neuro Tyrant can also potentially be affecting it for an additional -1 on a 3rd battle shock check, which happens first, to be fair. So you can be just trying to force massive numbers of battle shock checks on an opponent, and that's what the Deathleaper is really, really good at doing. What you want to set up is a situation where you have a unit that you really need to be battle shocked, or you want to be battle shocked. Charge that Deathleaper into it, try to convert a single attack to turn on Deathleaper's battle shock ability, then Shadow in the Warp them to make use of the Deathleaper's -1 leadership. It's not 100% guaranteed that you'll get the battle shock on that unit, but it is very likely, and even if you don't, she's only 70 points, so you're not even losing that much if she fails and dies. Pretty useful units. They are extremely good at scoring, they're very good at secondaries, and they also are good at fighting. You'll almost always include 1 or 2 in your list just to give you additional forward presence in the game, and also to be able to, maybe shore up your fight around the flanks. In Vanguard Onslaught, you're almost always windmill slamming 3 Lictors and the Deathleaper in your army, just to give yourself that additional Alpha Strike potential and mobile units that you can use to run around the table and skirmish. That moves us on to the premium frontline brawler of the Tyranid faction, the Maleceptor. These guys didn't really get too much of a points increase in the data slate update, which shocked me because the Maleceptor was already being taken in heavy numbers by Tyranid players moving up into the post-data slate season, but now with their new detachments out, most of their detachments are benefited from having Maleceptors in them, so the stock of the Maleceptor is just going up and up and up. It's to the moon. These guys are ridiculously hard to kill for their points value. They're high toughness, 4+ invulnerable save, potentially -1 to be hit, and sometimes even -1 to be wounded if your opponent is below half strength. A lot of times what you're just going to be doing is sending them into the middle of the table, pecking away at your opponent with their pretty solid ranged attack in the early game. If your opponent comes in to try to contest your objectives, the Maleceptor most likely shrugs a bunch of their damage, or at least makes it kind of inefficient to attack them because it's hard to kill them efficiently. And then over the course of a couple turns, reduces them to below half strength and basically becomes invincible to whatever is shooting at them. Being monsters, with the new Big Guns Never Tire rule, they can shoot out of melee as well, as long as they take their -1 penalty and don't shoot blast weapons into melee. So once they're stuck into an enemy unit and just tarpeting it eternally, they can still be firing their gun and accruing value elsewhere. And their melee attacks, while not really the focus of the unit, aren't really that bad. They're sort of medium strength and AP, but high damage. So if you convert those attacks, they randomly just blow tanks up in melee, which is always funny when it happens. Honestly, I think almost every Tyranid list should probably start with Maleceptors, which feels weird to say, because I do think that it is a little bit of an unfortunate place for the faction to be, to just have one staple unit that they're almost always taking. But on the flip side, it's really good. And it gives the detachments in the Tyranid faction that aren't as survivable as others on a unit that can take the middle of the table, continue to accrue value and damage, and force the primary objective through, wherein the rest of their army would have a tough time doing that. And that moves us on to the number 4 unit in the faction. These are Ripper Swarms. Like I said before, with the Pyrovore, having a single entity unit for a very low cost is just good in and of itself. And Rippers do that, but also they deep strike. So that's great. You should probably be taking 2-ish units of Ripper Swarms, just one individual Ripper Swarm in most of your armies, simply for the fact that sometimes you pull Investigate Signals and want to deep strike a bunch of Rippers all around the table in order to score that objective. But worst case scenario, they screen, they get engaged on all fronts, they cleanse objectives. Obviously, so you have to have something else next to the objective to cleanse it, because they can't do it themselves, being OC0. That OC0 is the big downside to the unit, but they're so cheap that you won't really notice it. And even in the games where you don't need the Rippers, you don't really feel bad about having included them. 2 units, it definitely feels like the sweet spot to me, so you can deep strike 1 on round 2 and 1 on round 3. Sometimes if you have filler points, you can take a 3rd unit if you need to screen your backline or something, and they're just really nice to have. I love them. I love these little guys. The Biovore is the next one. These guys have always been great in the 10th edition Tyranid Codex, just for the ability to, again, they just create units. They create units for very inexpensive expensive points, which allow you to score secondary objectives. So their ability to seed Spore Mines, while it has been depowered in the new codex, only being able to be used by 1 unit per turn, is still fine. These guys are still going to be able to put Spore Mines exactly where you need them and get you a bunch of secondary objective points, be able to screen out areas of the table. Spore Mines in 10th edition are also super useful for other reasons as well, given the fact that they prevent advances, either starting or ending within 6 inches of them. They basically just hold up the minefield sign and your opponent gets really scared of them and doesn't go near them, which can, in some instances, really mess up your opponent's ability to interact with you. If they have armies that are reliant on advancing and shooting or advancing and charging in order to close the distance and engage with you, being able to seed Spore Mines into annoying places in the table where they're not able to get their units to move efficiently without not advancing them, they can actually mess up a lot of factions. It's a huge deal in some matchups being able to do that. So movement blocking is super useful with Spore Mines. Scoring objectives is super useful with Spore Mines. In worst case scenario, you'd have a devastating wounds indirect fire gun, which isn't great, but it's not bad either. Sometimes you just need an extra damage or two to finish off a unit and prevent it from healing or running away, and the Biovore has that in the chamber in case you need it. Really never an instance where you're sad about taking the Biovore, and the new expanded model, unlike the Pyrovore, which has to be aggressive and move up the table to engage with your opponent, is actually a little bit of a buff for the Biovore because it means it screens more area in your backfield. It's harder to deep strike around this guy now because he is that much more voluminous, at least on his area denial zone 9 inches around him. That's a big deal for this little dude, and I think you'll never feel bad about taking one of them in your army. I wouldn't take more than one, but the 0-1 Biovore is definitely a solid include. And that moves us on to the penultimate unit in the Tyranid Codex, and this unit kind of came out of nowhere. Was not expecting this one to be as powerful as it was, but it is the Lictor. These guys have entirely transformed, in my opinion, the Tyranid faction. Tyranids had a sub-theme of having a lot of Battleshock Matter stuff with their abilities like the Screamer Killer to force Battleshock checks on enemies, and with their Shadow in the Warp, obviously, but they didn't really have a payoff for it. They could Battleshock you and kind of like mildly annoy you, but that was it. And now, with the Lictor, they give you massive debuffs if you fail those Battleshock checks. So these guys give you +1 to wound against Battleshocked enemies within 12 inches and -1 for those enemies to hit you. You're able to engage in melee with them. You can deal massive additional damage to them that you couldn't previously. Plus, they have a tougher time swinging back into you. Plus, if you Battleshock them on their turn and it carries over to your turn, it's going to continuously affect them. And on top of that, they also have their own outlet for Battleshock checks as well. They force a Battleshock check to an enemy unit within 12 inches in your command phase, so they can even potentially turn on their own buffs themselves. Honestly, even as a lone operative infiltrator unit that's hard to kill, the Lictor is almost worth including without the Battleshock effect. With those Battleshock abilities, being able to stack a bunch of Battleshock checks on your opponent's units and then potentially get +1 to wound them means that they shore up the Tyranid's weakness of hitting power pretty effectively. They can really mess with your opponent's ability to contest or hold your objectives, especially if they have fast, low leadership chaff infantry that run onto your objectives. Having Lictors nearby means you can force 2 or 3 Battleshock checks on that unit, Battleshock it before the end of your command phase when primary objective scoring checks, and then suddenly they're not contesting you anymore, you retain all your objectives, your opponent's very sad. I recommend that almost every single Tyranid list include 3 of them. 2, like at the minimum, but you'll probably be happier with 3, to be honest. You can also potentially get some synergies between them and other leadership reducing effects. Things like the Deathleaper's aura is also a big deal. Starting to force Battleshock checks at -1 within 6 inches of that lady is enormous. Just so much synergy with the Lictor, and good at scoring secondaries, just like no downsides whatsoever. They even have a good melee attack. A strength 6 AP2 melee attack isn't too bad, and they themselves are hard to kill with stealth and a 4+ invulnerable save and a bunch of wounds. Just for 65 points a model, absolute steal. These things are super duper duper good. And that moves us on to the #1 unit in the army, the Gargoyles. I hinted at it previously when we talked about the other battle line Gaunt units. Gargoyles are nuts, and I'm glad they didn't get changed in the new codex. They are ridiculously fast with a base move of 12 inches and fly. They have an assault weapon, so they're able to advance and shoot, and once they shoot, they then can move to another 6 inches. So their ability to just jet across the table and steal opponents' objectives is basically unparalleled almost in the entire game, especially since they're OC2, so you don't even need that many of them to steal objectives away from even hefty enemy units. The other thing that they can, the fact that that second move takes place in the shooting phase as well gives them survivability against Overwatch. You can advance to a position that's outside your opponent's line of sight, for example, then shoot something random with an 18-inch gun, so it's not even that hard to get range on, use the and then use the fire and fade move to get them onto an objective or something. The flexibility of this unit is insane. You can use them to block movement on enemy units, you can use them to steal objectives, you can use them to screen weird places of the table, you can use them to just even hold your own backline objectives or act as deep strikers. They can use their fire and fade ability out of deep strike, so they can deep strike 9 inches away from an opponent who thinks that they're screening out their objective, shoot that opponent, and then move 6 inches closer to steal the objective from them anyway. The flexibility is almost literally unparalleled. Not only are Tyranids good at scoring secondaries and keeping a dominance on primary objectives because of their big brawlers in the center like Maleceptors and Norn Emissaries, the Gargoyles give them the fast, high OC units that they need to keep your opponent's score down as well, and makes playing against, or at least scoring highly against Tyranids, an absolute nightmare, because you can probably kill them all, but the downside is that you're going to be doing so with a massive points deficit, and the challenge is increasing that deficit. And Gargoyles basically make that entire game plan possible. Every Tyranid list should have 2 units of 10 at least, probably worth taking 3, and larger lists that are focused on more infantry, like Unending Swarm, for example, are probably recommended to take a couple units of 20 as well, so that you can screen out enormous areas of the table, take multiple objectives, and then respawn them. And because they have Deep Strike, once they go into Strategic Reserve, they then can Deep Strike back on the table and then shoot and move and continue to take objectives. Their objective control game is insane, and they're also just useful in other capacities too. Never leave home without Gargoyles. They're ridiculously strong. The best unit in Tyranids, in my opinion. And with that, that is the entirety of the Tyranid faction. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about this breakdown, and if you have any other placements that you would put these Tyranid units at. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks to Vox Link for supporting the video and sponsoring the channel. And thanks to everybody else who supports the channel and makes Tactical Tortoise possible. Either YouTube channel members, you can join in the link down below the video. You get some access to member exclusive videos, cool emotes, and a little badge on your profile, as well as patrons over at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, who can also get access to those videos and get some benefits in the Tactical Tortoise Discord as well. It's all good stuff. I love you all. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.